What's up? My name is Chris Smith, and this is a video about how to build a quick admin panel or GUI for your Firebase instance in just a few minutes. Check it out. So I started out with some dummy data, which I loaded into my cloud Firestore instance to give us some data to work with. And the end result will be this Firestore admin panel, which will allow us to manage all of our Firestore documents. And with that, we'll be able to create, edit, read, and delete any of these items directly from this UI. To build this, we'll start with first setting up the Firebase authentication. Second, building out the UI and stubbing out the individual components. Third, we'll create our queries. Fourth, we'll link those queries to the UI. And fifth, we'll do some testing and make sure it all works. So first, we'll set up the Firebase authentication by going into the Retool app, creating a new blank app, give it a name, and then in the bottom panel, choose Create New Resource. And from there, we'll create a Firebase resource, give it a name, and then log into our Firebase console and pull up the specific URL for the project, paste that in, get the project ID from the settings panel. And then next we're going to go to the settings again and we'll generate a private key within the service accounts section. Paste that in and you can click test connection to make sure the connection is good. If you have any other questions on this, you can find the docs that'll be linked in the video description. Next, we lay out the user interface. To do this, we'll open up the right-hand panel and grab a table component, drop that down, expanding it to be a little bit larger and setting it to a compact mode to handle more data. Drop in a text field and use Markdown to set the title size. Next, we'll delete the default data in the table so that we're ready to populate the table with data from our query in the next couple steps. We're now ready to create our queries. To do this, we'll go down to the bottom panel and choose New Resource Query. Next, we choose the Firestore resource that we created in the first step, set the service type to Firestore, and the action type to Get Collections in order to run a test and make sure we're able to communicate with the service. We do this, and we can hit Preview and see that it returns back one option, which shows us that it's working. Next, we'll change the action type to Query Firestore and select our collection ID. When we do this, we can see that we get a set of data back, which looks like it's correct from Firestore. So let's save this as list documents, and next we want to duplicate this a few times to create our next few queries for updating, deleting, and creating documents. And we'll set the action type to match the correct action for each of these queries. Next, we'll map the queries to the user interface components by selecting the table and in the inspection pane typing in curly braces the query list documents, and that'll start to show us what options are available. So we'll choose .data. That then populates the table with the rows and columns that have come in from the list documents query. And we want to select the columns that we want to be editable and make sure that they're set to editable in the column selector on the right hand side. So we'll do that for each of the columns. And next we need to link in the edit functionality into the table. So to do this, we will set the bulk update action to the update document query, meaning when a row is edited, it'll trigger that query. And the same for the on-row add, we will link that to the create document query. And lastly, we want to add in an action column which will give us a button that allows us to delete individual rows. And so we'll give this a name, and then we will link this to the delete document query. Next, let's link the update document query to the changes in the table. One helpful way to work with components is to open the left-hand panel and you can inspect the various properties that exist for the component. For the table, we have a record updates property, which will be a set of the changed rows in object format. For simplicity, we'll just reference the first changed row and map that into the update document query. And so we can save and run this and see that we get a successful response back. But we might see that the data is actually not showing the updated changes in the table above. So what we need to do is set an onSuccess trigger to call the list documents query to run again, and that will update the table with the most recent data from the database. Now let's connect the delete button in the table and pass the ID of that record back to the delete action in the Firestore database. To do this, we'll reference the row on which the delete button was pressed using the I variable, and grab the ID from that row and pass it into that action. We'll also make sure that we have an onSuccess trigger to call the list documents query again and refresh our table. Lastly, we want to link our new row data from the table into our insert document action in the create document query. To do this, similar to update rows, there will be a property called new row, which will include the values from that new row. So we'll create the JSON object and map in those values and save the query. We can test this out by putting a little bit of data in those fields and running it. And then finally, we'll make sure that we're also calling list documents again for the onSuccess trigger so that we know that our table is up to date. Let's test the functionality by editing a row in the table and saving changes. And we see that that row is updated. Next, let's add a new row and save those changes. And we see the new row exists. And finally, let's test the delete functionality, and we see that that works. So we've now completed the admin panel. Thanks for watching, and I hope that was helpful for you. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.